Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Storytime. I am Dr. Jennifer Bird. I am a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible, and in particular, when they find something that, when applied uncritically, is harmful to themselves and or others. So that's why I am interested in engaging topics like gender and sexuality and how people engage the Bible in relation to those topics and realities for people today. So I am really excited for you all to see and meet and hear this week's guest. Let me do the official introduction. So this is my colleague, Joseph A. Marchal. Sorry, Joe, I meant to ask you. I always get confused on how to pronounce your last name. Is it Marshall or Marchal? See, I've heard both, and we'll discuss it when you come live, when you're here. I'm so sorry about that. I meant to ask you before you went live. So Joseph A. Marchal is professor of religious studies and women and gender studies at Ball State University. They are an author, editor, and or co-editor of more than 10 books, including, and the most recent, which we will be discussing in particular today, Appalling Bodies, Queer Figures Before and After Paul's Letters. Stay tuned for very interesting engagement about that. Also, Bodies on the Verge, Queering Pauline Epistles, for those of you interested in non-traditional and perhaps kind of invigorating and enlightening ideas about these things. Definitely not for a general audience, but it's good stuff. Also, Sexual Disorientations, Queer Temporalities, Affects, Theologies. And those are in the last 7 years, all three of those. 2 forthcoming collections on trans biblical interpretation, and the politics of respectability. Love that. In Black, womanist, and queer approaches. Lots to mull over, sink your teeth into if you're interested in that kind of thing. Coming out very soon. So they are also currently serving as chair of the Society of Biblical Literature's first ever committee for LGBTQ, I said it in the wrong order, LGBTIQ plus scholars and scholarship. And this is very exciting to me. I get chills every time I think about this. Founding co-editor with Melissa M. Wilcox of the new journal, QTR, a journal of trans and queer studies in religion. So I'll refer to my colleague as Jay the rest of the time here. And let me just go ahead and bring them out. Jay, welcome to, hi there. Welcome to Storytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for sharing your time and your space here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It means a lot to me. I'm going to have a hard time not calling you Joe, but I'll do my best to call you Jay today.
That's okay. It's long histories of reception when it comes to names here, and I'm in an ambivalent spot about names. You're not going to do it wrong.
Okay.
You're just going to do your best.
Right. I have to say,
as I think I joked already, it's not canonical.
It's not canonical yet. Yeah, right. Jay specifically. Yeah.
Our names are not scriptural. It's fine.
Right. But I've enjoyed watching you with this whole pronoun thing over the years. I noticed a couple years back. I don't know when you started it, but I noticed a couple years back when you said your pronouns were anything with respect, and I was like, oh, I like that. That's. I know it's all a big mixture, and I try to respect every single time, every way I can. But that was kind of fun. So now you've moved on to theys. It sounds like they, them.
Again, mostly any pronouns. Jay and they are working just fine, but it's
all good.
Different folks use different pronouns for me. My colleague Melissa, who you already mentioned, jokes about like that they have a reader response kind of approach to it. Like think about like what pronouns you think of when you see me, and why is that? So yes. Anyways.
Yeah. Right. And when you do have history with someone, and you've seen them change and grow, right? Or change the way they present, even, or the way they are choosing to be, and I don't know. So yeah, it's kind of fun to learn and walk with people, walk with each other through some of these things, I think. So
thank you. There's lots of opportunities for learning, and we learn a lot from our colleagues still coming up and from our students, colleagues, and there's exciting and daunting things happening all around us, right, that we can learn from.
It's true. Well, I was going to just throw out there, I think I put it in the description for today's video that Jay and I met. I think you were the first colleague that I connected with outside of my PhD work, like outside of my, studies specifically. So the first, and it was just this delight for me because you were doing work that I wanted to be able to say I was going to be doing, and I just had so much respect for you when I met you. And it was one of the greatest compliments of my career that I was on a panel with you and Aaron Runyons. Like, it just felt huge to me. So I don't know that I've ever told you that, but it looks like if I have, you'd forgotten. So it looks like that's kind of fun.
It's very, very sweet. I just remember we were in the same room a lot, right? It was like, who's this person from? Is it Vanderbilt, right? At the time,
Yep.
We were in the same kind of feminist, womanist, critical theory, cultural studies, room. So if people don't know, like, SBL is the big kind of dorky, like all the Bible nerds, mostly from North America, but the people who can afford to come.
Yeah.
And we all just go to, horrible conference rooms, right? For 2.5 hours at a time. And especially as graduate students, you're so thrilled to see the people that you've only read about or that you've only met once or twice in person.
Right.
It's a really wonderful experience filled with lots of letdowns. But also lots of surprises, because you go to the session to see so-and-so who's such a name.
Right.
And especially if they're senior white guys and they are sometimes metaphorically or literally physically taking naps up there when they're not presenting. And
then you discover someone else really interesting on the panel that kind of slipped in, and you're like,
well, not slipped in, they got in probably on the merits of a strong abstract, and nobody knows who they are because they're an early career scholar.
Yes.
And they present dazzling, interesting new things that you hadn't considered, or you realize they're reading some of the same people I'm reading. And for some reason they like the letter of Hebrews, and I don't want to read that at all. But I do want to read these interlocutors, or I also care. I have some of the same communities of accountability as these folks. Yes, and then Erin Runyons is a fabulous scholar. If people don't know her work, The Babylon Complex is one of her more recent books from Fordham University Press, doing really, really good stuff too, thinking about imprisonment and imprisonment rhetorics and. There may be
element of scripture.
Yes,
Right,
we may finally be time for some abolitionist hermeneutics for biblical interpretation. Right,
she'll be coming on in July. Actually,
yes,
she's coming in. Yeah,
yes, that's a treat. Everyone tune in for that one.
Yeah.
Or if you're watching this, stop this one and go look at the recording of Dr. Runyons and Dr. Bird. Don't listen to our conversation.
No,
until you're tie.
So no, don't listen to Jay here on that one. So let's get into you though, because I know that people don't know who you are and all that stuff, but you're such an interesting person as a person, to talk with, to listen to. I have always enjoyed reading your scholarship. Not that I've read all of it, but everything I read of yours, I come away, I feel like I've come away a better person. I come away a more intelligent person. I come away with things. I always, you tend to be very... you're just so clever and interesting. And so I know you're not a public scholar, so nobody's necessarily heard of your work. And that's why I want to have you on. And as a part of getting into all that, why people should care about the work you do, let's do a little bit of a story time about you, Jay.
Okay.
And who you are, the background that you feel like sharing that explains why you've chosen to do this work that you do.
Gosh, I mean, there's a place here where we could joke about queer temporality and history, right? That there's no simple narrative of origins. I know that's what we like to construct when we're talking about Jesus and pals in the first century, right? A lot of times our colleagues have these stories about the Bible in their lives. Or about kind of how it shaped them. I definitely was raised in a religious family, to kind of guilty white liberal social justice oriented Catholics for parents who cared quite a lot about education, but also about the world being a better place, and that was very much impressed on us, but I had many experiences of just dissonance over the years. And
dissonance, yeah, I'm going to interrupt a little bit if you don't mind, just so
sure.
you can help tell your story, if that's okay. It is interesting to point out Catholic is kind of, as we know, kind of getting a bad rap these days in lots of pieces, but also there is this segment of Catholicism that is very much, social justice oriented, right? So the problems of Catholicism over the centuries, but then the wanting to make the world a better place. So I think that there are people watching this who will resonate with both pieces, right? Having that upbringing. So that's helpful. But what's the dissonance about for you? I mean, are there a couple pieces? I imagine there are volumes, right, of examples. What's the
one? I think one of the first that kind of as a younger person was the Gulf War. And people who surrounded me talked a lot about being pro-life, and the United States was going to war, and there was no pushing back on that at all. And and only some of the people in the circles that I traveled, that included Catholic Christians, but also Protestant Christians, and not particularly religious folks, and a few Muslim folks. There were folks who were definitely protesting and objecting. But the overwhelming majority of folks who just kind of thought, "Hoorah, rah, this is going to be great, and we're going to go get Saddam Hussein," and that was one very real dissonance. I always felt a sense of misfit, though, in the back of my mind, but I didn't have the words for it for a very, very long time. I come from a relatively large family. For times now, I'm one of 5 children, and I have 3 sisters. So I'm surrounded by strong, smart women.
And you're number 4?
I'm 2. I'm 2 out of sequentially in the rankings. I'm sure I'm very low. I'm probably like my 6th or 7th favorite child of my parents, right? But sequentially. But like that's why maybe I think about time queerly, because what is time anyways? I think I didn't know that when people were saying misogynist things, that like I grew up in a very loving household, but also deeply oppositional household, and we were very mean to each other. And so I think I thought when people were being misogynists. And I didn't have that word yet. They're like, oh, they're just being mean to people that they love, right? It took me forever to have like a feminist consciousness kind of click late in high school, early in college. So like, oh, wait, no, like these people are serious. They actually think that like 50+% of the population is inferior to them. I understood very, very early age what racism was. Like, like living in America, if you pay attention at all. Like racism and poverty, we're absolutely riven by it, and our neighborhoods are driven by it. So racism did not surprise me, even though it not that it didn't bother us. It bothered us very much, and I also thought like a lot of the cheerleading for the various wars that we've publicly and not so publicly engaged in the United States has a lot to do with racism and histories of colonialism. So I think those were amongst, I guess, some of the dissonances.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does.
But I do want to say that there's long and distinguished histories of whether you want to call it progressivism or liberalism or radicalism, or justice-oriented traditions inside of Roman Catholicism, but also inside of Christianity. It just so happens that the loudest and some of the most powerful voices give voice to some of the most regressive traditions, right? So for your Christian listeners, like Christianity is hella large and hella weird and hella long,
diverse,
and there's a lot of stuff that you could draw upon, and it's basically on you to decide what type. If you're going to be inside the streams of tradition, it's up to you to decide which streams of traditions you're going to engage with and capitalize upon. I used to say that I'm an ex-Catholic, but I have many good Jewish friends and beloveds, and when they taught me about the idea of being ethnically Jewish, and that makes sense in American Judaism, and they're like, sweetheart, no, like you're Catholic, right? Like there's very much a way that Andrea and Joan and the women of my of like I'm a grandchild of the Depression in a lot of ways, right? So I am ethnically Catholic, but I would no longer say that I subscribe to the creed or anything like that. But happily, I teach at a state university, so I don't have to tell people these things, right?
Right.
I tell them my job is to make you a smarter, a more informed, and a better, more reflexive version of yourself, regardless of what you are. And we are often very successful at that.
Yes.
Not always, but often.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we are. You are. We are. We tend to be. Okay, but there's a piece of what you have shared, or you've left a piece out, I think, and that pertains to embodiment. And I'm wondering if there's an early piece that you can. Again, I appreciate you're like, yeah, we don't do origins because that's a misplaced focus and intention and energy or something. But there's something about talking about an early-ish moment or story or something about embodiment, and for you and within a Christian or Catholic. Christian is the big umbrella, but many Catholics like to differentiate. So I'm just doing that for people who are listening. A Catholic space, a Christian influenced country. I don't know, part of the world that you grew up in. Not sure which way it works for you, but embodiment, right? Your particular embodiment, what our culture has tended to say about embodiment, our bodies, sex, sexuality, desires. Is there anything that you can say? Because I think it is a piece, right? It's a big piece of why you do what you do, isn't it?
I mean, yes and no.
Okay,
because on the one hand, really, I figured out what I thought I wanted to do when I realized that I could study religion and gender together. That there are ways in which, specifically doing feminist and kind of what we now call intersectional feminist work, like that was it. That was the jam. That was like, oh my gosh, like these are the words that I'm trying to do. And we'll get to Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza in a little while.
Sure.
But it really was like in college where I kind of realized, oh, no, the way the world is structured is not the way it should be. It has quite a lot to do with how we talk religiously, how we form communities that we call religious, how we use argumentation or rhetorics that we call religious. And, you could have mixed feelings. Some people would say that's not really religious. That's not authentically religious if it's offensive, if it's oppressive. But I also think we kind of have to own, right? Like, there's a history here. Like religious organizations have done that. This is also part of your branch of Christianity. It's not the only thing. It's not the sum total. But I would say, again, being raised Catholic, I went to a very butchy boys' high school. And, I was definitely a nerd, and the feelings of not measuring up. We have these words now that Butler's work about gender trouble. I think I've just always been troubled by gender and not known it. And I think Joy Ladin's got this wonderful essay in this volume that I'm so fortunate to be co-editing with colleagues that talks about kind of gender failure and how actually, if you stop and think about it, almost all of us have moments by which there are expectations of how we're supposed to perform, right? And if you ever were raised like act like a man, and we now have this weird like little man, right? Like I know little adult males, right? That's not what we mean by that. We, like we're trying to train young boys to behave a certain way in terms of scripts of masculinity that are, for lack of a better word, hegemonic, right? They're prevailing and they're dominant. And nobody measures up to those norms, right? We all disappoint somebody.
That's why they have to be keeping repeated, right?
Right? Yes, that's what Butler means by performativity, right? It's that it has to be repeated. And there's a fundamental instability about gender. And the Romans knew it. They were very anxious about it. It seems pretty clear that the people who were behind the materials that get canonized as Christian scriptures were also anxious about it.
I just love the way you say this stuff. I'm like, yeah, that was very kind way of saying it. It seems as if they seem to be uncomfortable too. Yeah, they might.
We don't really know.
Right,
We just have these texts.
What we know about rhetoric tells us that.
Right, so we have to infer backwards
We do.
from that.
Yep.
So I don't want to be like, oh, I didn't belong in high school or what have you.
Right.
But there's dissonance, like I said, like about best ways of performing and enacting. But I got out. I graduated. I got to college. I did the grade thing. I did the I'm writing the books. I'm doing whatever.
Yeah. So that kind of does lead us into what undergrad, right? Is that when you discovered you could do religion and feminism, or was it before that? I don't know if it was.
I was just talking about this with I think a young person earlier today, back when I started college, and I'm not going to say what date. Universities didn't want you to declare majors in your first year, let alone decide what you're going to major in before applying. Like we are doing college and university recruitment and admissions all wrong now.
I mean,
all wrong.
Me too. Yeah, I agree.
All wrong. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to be. I just knew that the world was not the way it should be. And that, again, based on my upbringing about service, about injustice, it's your job, if you have any gifts and privileges, to help to change the conditions. Right. Agreed. And so I thought like, oh, I'll probably do poli-sci and international relations. I took a course in that first semester. It was horrible. I hated it. It was boring and dry. And I'm sure I was a horrible student.
Right.
And I try to remember that when students aren't always at their best in environments that I'm leading or helping other people lead.
Yep. It's nothing personal.
And so I took like I had a really wonderful general education curriculum my first year. It was actually, I think everyone's enrolls in the first year studies. You take lots of seminars, you read a lot of books, you think a lot about who you are. And so I came to, like, at my university, it was theology, and they didn't call it women's and gender studies, it was gender studies. So by sophomore year, I settled into theology and gender studies, the realization that not only that, because you could take AP in everything, and I did, except for religion, right? So the only thing I wasn't so-called advanced in, I think my parents are still sad that I'm not in math or science. Gotcha. But they had me teach Latin, had me learn Latin, so that's their fault, right? I learned all the horrible, dirty words in an ancient language, and here I am now, still living half my life in the first century.
Indeed.
So, and I ended up working with Mary Rose D'Angelo. I don't know if you know her scholarship, a fabulous feminist scholar of New Testament early Christianity. I think she was very confused by me, justifiably so. I was confused by me.
What do you mean confused? How was she?
Why would someone who, I was socialized male, I was male identified, like, why are you doing feminist work?
Oh,
right? Like why would a guy student be doing feminist work? And I wrote a really embarrassing senior thesis with her. But doing that work exposed me to like some just amazing approaches and amazing ways of thinking about not just the ancient world, but the world in general. And it just kept going from there.
Let me see if I can pull up something to share here. Where am I? Rhetoric. Did I not? I did have, but she said, what happened? Oh, there it is. Where is it? Sorry. I
tried to pull some of the books on the back shelf too behind me. So there you go. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for doing that. That was
so Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. So if your friends and your viewers don't know, I mean, incredible, groundbreaking. I don't want to use too many colonizing words like pioneering, etc. But like, if there are words that we would use for a scholar that way, we'd use them for Professor Schussler Fiorenza. Dozens of books, like a feminist biblical scholar doing feminist biblical scholarship in a time in which it harmed your career.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And along am I'm just kind of like blithely trying to write about like 4th century cross-dressing women saints in the desert. with Mary Rose D'Angelo, and she's like, "You really should study Greek." I was like, "Okay, I will," and I was a little bit, and I was trying to figure out how to get into this project beyond just the primary text, and that's when I encountered Elizabeth's work, ESF's work, the first time, and specifically But She Said. A lot of people encountered her work first in Memory of Her, which is this kind of landmark book, which kind of presents a kind of a feminist reconstruction, how to do feminist historical reconstructive work,
Right.
specifically of the New Testament early Christian era, of these what she would call these basileia movements, not these early Jesus movements, basileia, which you could translate kingdom, but you can also translate empire. Some people translate it kingdom, and so she's got these really great works that are about historical reconstruction, but she recurrently returns to method and to approach. Right? And But She Said is one of those books. So the subtitle here is Feminist Practices of Biblical Interpretation. And so that's the first time I encountered the term kyriarchy, which she coined. And so we might need to break that down for folks.
Let's do that. Let's I'm gonna stop sharing. I was trying to think, should have written it up, but
that's right. So like someone maybe could type it in the chat. So it's KYRIARCHY. I feel like I'm a little bit like I'm writing at the board and talking at the same time. I'm not positive I spelled it right.
You did, but I put it in the chat for people.
So an oversimplified way of talking about this is Sophia Renzo is saying, well, okay, if we use patriarchy as a way to analyze social systems, right? Which assumes arche, who is ruling, right? And who is ruling males are, and males specifically in a paternal role, in a fatherly role, right? And so this sort of, if we're going to oversimplify it, we'd say the planet is round and patriarchy cuts the planet in half. And the top half is inhabited by men who act as in paternal roles, and they rule over women. Right. And she's like, that really doesn't actually make sense, right? Like, not all men are in relation to ruling in the same way, and not all women are in the same relation towards ruling. Right. Yeah. Like, just if we're dealing with the ancient world, how about enslavement, right? Roman Empire is this giant enslaving economy. It's the only way it could do what it does. Right.
Yeah. How do you account for that if it's just, we're talking just male, female?
Yes. So she coined the term kyriarchy from the Greek word kurios, so Kyrios. And this is a word that can be translated a number of ways. The most common way we translate is Lord, right? Which is very fraught because it's a title we use for the divine, whether we're talking about just the God of Judaism, the God of Second Temple Judaism, the God of the Hebrew Bible, or whether we're talking about Jesus, right? It's kind of one of, I often joke that, Lord is not Jesus' first name and Christ is not his last name, but, right? It makes Jesus his middle name too. I was raised H was his middle name, but anyways. So kurios is a title that you'd use in Greek. Certainly you'd use it for the male who's the head of a household. Right. Yep. So an adult man, probably who has a degree of economic influence and power. You'd use this if you are an enslaving person, if you're an enslaving man, kurios, to your doulos,
lord over the house,
You'd use it if you are a local ruler or local governor. It's a title that was given to the emperor, right? So it's all these overlapping roles. And so rather than thinking about maybe all of humanity or maybe all of the created order as one big circle over which we can simplify, there's a group of people over this group of people, we need to think in terms of a pyramid. Not just a triangle, but a pyramid. So you need three-dimensional depth. Right. And kyriarchy says the people at the top are most like the kurios. They're the people who inhabit all of these roles. They're the elite, citizen, economically empowered, enslaver, high imperial status, performing gender appropriately, right? Because you could lose your status. You could be hyper wealthy and powerful, and you could lose your attributed status. Speak again, this gender failing that even at the top can happen. No pun intended with topping, but we can talk about that later. So kyriarchy, right? Again, if you think about it as a pyramid, there's a lot less space at the top. Indeed. Because that's true, right? The people who are absolutely in charge in the time of the Roman Empire, it's the emperor. Right. Maybe now it's heads of state or people who are in control of multinational corporations. Like, so maybe it's Warren Buffett and Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe it's that really bald guy from Amazon. What's his name?
Yeah, Jeff Bezos.
Bezos.
We talked about him before on here too. Like,
right. Anyways, not trying to give free advertising for these folks.
I know.
Right. And they're at the top because they have the right gendered comportment. Right. They're from the right ethno-racial group. Right. They have economic power. And so all these things are intertwined. Right. And you've got to imagine the pyramid being filled out by trajectories going downward that interact. So the things that we call sexism, racism, ethnocentrism, poverty, heterosexism, transphobia, colonialism, imperialism, the way we kind of imagine our dominionism over the environment and over the created order, all these things aren't separate vectors. These are vectors of oppression that intertwine and reinforce each other. Right? So there's a reason. There's a reason why the majority of the world's poor are women. Right. There's a reason why, like, it's not all men, hashtag not all men, right, who are in charge, whether it's the Roman Empire or any imperial system, right? It has to be the right men at that. And this helps us to better understand not only the Roman imperial world, or not only the ancient worlds in which various biblical texts were generated and were circulated, but this helps us to better, as I've already tried to indicate, helps us to better understand the planet now. It helps us explain Margaret Thatcher. Right? Margaret Thatcher, milk snatcher, right? She took free meals from young people. She endorsed horrifying economic practices, right? Her proximity to the top of a kyriarchal order. She had the wrong gender for power, right? But she performed kyriarchal authority in every other way, right? So this also explains like how like a trad wife kind of thing, right, can exist as well. And so this is also why it's important. I also find, I don't know if Dr. Schuster would completely agree with this kind of extension of it, but kyriarchies have enough space in them that there's small pyramids inside of them.
Yep.
Right. So at the very, very least, if you are amongst a conquered population in the first century, but you're otherwise a free male with some education and some economic privilege, there's all these other people who are your subordinates. And well, at least I'm not an enslaved person. At least I don't work in mines, right? At least I'm not a woman, right? At least I'm not these other conquered people who are even lower. And that's actually how kyriarchy works. It sucks us in, right? With like, well, I benefit from these intertwining things because I'm positioned. I'm not at the top of the pyramid, but at least I'm not way at the bottom.
I can find a way to be okay with this mess that I'm in because I can see.
So if we have what Schuster would call a single axis of analysis of power, right? If we only think of it in terms of gendered status, if we only think about it in terms of economics, if we only think about it in terms of race or ethnicity, we are actually missing how each of those things works.
Yes.
Right? You can't understand sexism properly. Even if you're like, I only want to work on sexism. You can't understand sexism properly if you aren't also thinking about economic dynamics, racial dynamics, gendered and sexualized dynamics, embodied dynamics, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So discovering that was like, aha. And I ended up doing my master's with Dr. Schuster Fiorenza. And I found out there's such a thing as a women's studies in religion master's program. I was like, what? That can't be. That's a thing I could do. Like, I want to do that. And so, yes. And people love In Memory of Her, but I really think Rhetoric and Ethic, which is the other book that Dr. Bird's got up on screen here, really, really good stuff in terms of method and approach and helping us to think about how we can see both the present and the past differently so that we can make a more habitable, it's a low bar now, a more habitable future going forward, right? So I could talk some about why Rhetoric and Ethic is an important book, but I went on at length about kyriarchy, and I don't know if that was too fast.
No, I don't think it was too fast. I appreciate that. I keep forgetting that you were a very good educator. You did that before you went on to graduate work, and you're very good at doing.
I did teach high school for a year, which
which
is very dumb by all accounts. Like if you're gonna, that's the worst year to, like, it's the hardest thing to do. The first year.
Right. Yeah.
And I just moved on.
No, right. But no, I appreciate that. It's very rich what you just presented for us, and I appreciate the descriptiveness. So I think that people can track with that, and there's something to take from it one way or the other, I think. I was just going to say, it's funny because I was introduced to Elizabeth through Bread Not Stone. And I just needed her introduction, and that just lit me on fire. And I was like, oh my gosh, right. Yes. Applying this analysis to not just the text, but the way people are responding to the text and the things. And it's like, what? So, and then of course I really appreciate her rhetoric and ethic. There's 1 or 2 chapters in there I keep returning to.
That's the thing about her work and the reception of her work is there are generations of folks who frankly are poorly trained, who had only read in memory of her, were instructed to read it in order to explain why they disagree with it, or why it's inadequate, or why, she's not doing real history. Or why and then completely ignore, like, I think these are uncharitable and inaccurate readings, even of In Memory of Her. But then aside from that, like, she went on to keep revising and returning. She was super reflexive about her method and her approach and its effects. So you read Bread Not Stone. Oh my God, so that's an earlier version of kind of what happens in But She Said. Exactly. Rhetoric and Ethic came out, I think, in the late 90s. And that was like, my copy of that is falling apart. Like I carried that around in my doctoral work. Like it was so necessary for me to figure out what I was doing when I was writing my dissertation. It's an incredible book, and it's criminally underread and undercited. It is. It features, she was, I think, the first woman president. Is that right?
Yes, she was.
Of SBL. So it includes her presidential address, which is talking about the paradigms that we might use for approaching how to interpret the Bible. But really kind of this real sense that, like, well, any way in which we interpret the Bible has ethical and political import. Yes. Even if you claim, well, I'm just neutral. Right. Like, I'm just trying to tell you what the text really means or what actually happened. And those are very specific political and ethical stances you have to take. And Schuster Fiorenza is clear about there are not only rhetorics of the text that we have to grapple with, but there are the rhetorics of the interpretive work that we do. Yes. Right. Yes. And so there's a form of what we call rhetorical analysis that's very formal. Right. And that when you and I were probably studying, there were all these battles about, like, what genre should we put Paul's letters? Yeah. Is this forensic or is this epidatic? Right. Yep. And like, people published on this for quite some time. And on the one hand, it's sort of interesting. But on the other, it doesn't get us to the so what. Exactly. Right. It's a piece that can be useful. Right. Yeah. And it misses out on the ethics and the politics of the rhetoric. And rhetoric in the ancient world was training people to agree with this. It's about power. Exactly. Right? Language. How do you wield power through language? Right. Exactly. You do that clearly or appropriately, and we can all understand and fall in line and bow down to what's being said. And here's another place where I think kyriarchy as a conceptual tool helps us to see different social systems, including the present ones that we variously inhabit. But I also think this way of, like, okay, I think once you learn how to analyze rhetorics, not just in terms of their forms, but in terms of their effects and impacts in terms of dynamics of power and how they reinforce or undermine reigning or prevailing regimes, that's a thing you don't have to be a religious studies major. Right. You don't have to be a biblical scholar. Right. This is a skill that transfers all over the place, which is probably one of the reasons why they don't want people to major in religious studies and why they're actively defunding religious studies programs all over the country, because they don't actually want people to be smarter about religious rhetorics. And critically thinking and engaging, right? Yeah. Engaging instead of uncritically engaging.
To me, that becomes a way to talk about the materiality of texts, right? When you can understand what's happening to a certain degree, right? How are these functioning? What is this communicating? And then that becomes a thing that people embrace and empower and embody often without being aware of it, right? Yeah. For me, at least, that's how I think about it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I am very interested, if we can skip ahead a little bit. I do have several other books lined up, but maybe we can. So many
great books.
And that's just it. We actually I have mentioned before, actually, the queer. I'm going to just share it very briefly because I think I want to focus on this the appalling bodies. I thought I had that up. Here we go. So here's the. I think I've mentioned this before, so I think that's why I just want to share it briefly for folks to know this. From my perspective, part of what I'm doing is just letting you know that this other biblical scholarship exists, even if you're not going to go out and find it in a college or theological library, because this one's kind of expensive. You're not going to go purchase it for $200 off of.
There was a paperback from Pilgrim Press that I got.
Right, me too.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know where that went. I don't know if that's still available. But Ken Stone, there's been a bunch of folks who are doing LGBTIQ plus work, or what we are just broadly for shorthand. I'll use queer, and even if you don't like the word, it may not be for you. That's okay. Use your words. Right. I'm not speaking for everybody here. But Ken Stone has done some amazing work. And there's been literally decades of queer biblical interpretive work. Exactly. I know that for some folks, they might encounter it for the first time. That often happens with my students or with people, the audiences that I'm talking about. And there's lots of great ways to enter the conversation, and it's new to you. But that doesn't mean it hasn't been happening for quite some time.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Ken, Dr. Stone really kind of helps to articulate that this isn't just about, say, recuperating ancient gay people.
Right.
That this is as much also about a mode of analysis. So in fact, in a later book of his called Practicing Safer Texts, which is a wonderful pun, right?
Yes, it is.
And he also talks about biblical intercourse.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Textual intercourse. Sorry, that's it. Because that's what we're engaging in when we're interpreting biblical texts. That what you're doing when you're doing queer interpretive work is you're focusing on dynamics of normalization and naturalization. You're focusing on stigma, right? You're focusing on like how to both recognize, how to identify how those things work, but then how to resist, undermine, and transform the conditions that generated that stigma. So it's there are definitely versions of biblical scholarship. There are a lot about social location that say, I'm interpreting this as a blank. Right. And that's vital and important work. It is incredible work. I've learned so much from it. There's ways in which my work is like that and also not like that.
Yes.
And Dr. Stone's work is like that, and also pushes and say, no, this is more than just like one way of thinking about queer commentary is commentary performed by queer people.
Right.
But another way is thinking about it in terms of like queer as a verb.
Yes.
Right. And queering the text. Right. And queering the act of commentary, and how the Bible has been used to normalize and naturalize very constrained ways of thinking about gender, sexuality, and embodiment. Right. And the texts don't do oftentimes the things that people say it does. And oftentimes also the text does horrifying things.
Yeah, exactly.
Not quite the horrifying things that people are saying it does, but still horrifying things.
Right.
And so what do we do with that? So instead of just throwing it out, how do we engage it? Right. And that's, so Stone and I are informed by people like Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick and certain strands of Michel Foucault's work. And so encountering his work, encountering Bernadette Bruton's work, Randall Bailey has this really fabulous essay called "They're Nothing But Incestuous Bastards."
I love that chapter.
Which is a lot about like what is the work of sexuality doing in a number of Hebrew Bible texts? And in some ways, this isn't really about sex,
Right.
quote unquote, right? Like
Right.
this is very much about xenophobia.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And then coming back
the other through this
right.
language or label.
Yes. Yeah. So more people should be revisiting Randall Bailey's work as well. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I big fan of that chapter. I'm trying to find you here. Again, I don't want to take. I forgot to chat with you up front about how much time you have to give me today. I try not to go more than an hour, but so that's why I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit here.
Okay.
Yeah. But we can talk as long as you're comfortable. But I don't. I try to keep it around an hour for folks watching. But you mentioned Bernadette Bruton, and I'm embarrassed that I haven't read this yet.
Oh,
I know.
Dr. Berg.
How is it possible, right?
I mean, life is short. I understand. Right. This is an incredible book.
I have it.
Read whatever parts of it you want.
Yeah.
It is. Dr. Bruton is meticulous. Is smart and thorough and careful and also ethically committed.
Yes.
And so it's the first half is just gathering all of our evidence that we have for female homoeroticism in the ancient world. Right. And just that alone, like it's a resource right there.
Yeah,
and again, my copy of it is so beat up.
Is it? Yeah.
Right. And then the back half is a commentary on basically just the first chapter of Romans 1. Romans 1, right? And it is so thorough and I think so frank about what we can know and what we can't know about the past, about the silences that we've enacted when we talk about ancient, for lack of a better, ancient homosexuality or homoeroticism. Most of the time most scholars didn't even bother trying to figure out what women might have been doing.
Exactly.
And saying, well, there's no evidence for that. And she's like, oh yeah, watch me, right? Hold my beer, but for a decade. Because again, like the work, it's a monumental piece of scholarship. We did a special session on its impact, and it got published in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion a couple years ago.
Right.
And Dr. Bruton's also like generous to a fault as a scholar.
She is as a person. It's almost bizarre how kind and gentle she is because she's such a powerhouse. It's like, oh my gosh, how did these things all how is that all possible inside of the same person? Amazingly beautiful person. It was such an honor to meet her finally.
So it's really, but she's getting us to think about what are we doing when we're doing history. Right. And doing history, like is there such a thing as lesbian history? Like how to do it. What does it also mean to kind of be surprised by the past? to also like realize that like when you look at a certain set of materials, your narratives about how sexuality changed, because one big narrative, and David Halpern is sort of like one kind of icon of this or avatar of this, is to kind of insist that the way we talk about sexuality now is just not how ancient people did. Right? So he's got a famous essay that got turned into a book called 100 Years of Homosexuality. And on the one hand, this is very much true. The word homosexual had to be invented. Right? It was invented around the 1860s by some Germans. Right? And it's like we had to come up with the idea of sexual orientation. And I know that like 1860s seems like forever ago to most people, but as I said already, I live about half my life in the first century. This is recent news.
Exactly.
And so Halpern's saying, well, we have this idea like of an individual internal like sexual orientation that I have. I could be gay, or I could be bi, or I could be multisexual, or I could be lesbian and not do anything. It's like that would have made no sense. Right. In the first century. Ancient Greeks to ancient Romans, like to the Mediterranean world, would not have made sense. They sorted the stuff differently. And he has a point. They do sort things differently, but there might be, and one of the things that Bruton highlights is there might be more continuities between the past and the present than many folks want to admit. And unfortunately, many of these continuities are super icky, right? Are super awful, right? To borrow the language that Rhiannon Graybill, who I know you've talked to before, that people should check out that feature. Dr. Graybill's work is fabulous. Texts of Terror, incredible book, not an easy book to read, but an incredible book, right? And Bruton kind of says, like, there may just be like really horrible attitudes about women over the centuries, and that when we do a narrativization of male homoeroticism, like our story about centuries and decades and change might look different than if we focus on female homoeroticism. So that was really important for me to find my footing for trying to think differently about the people who are targeted by Paul's letters.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Which led eventually to the Appalling Bodies book. Right.
Yeah. So can we? Again, there are more up here that are important in this, but we might not get to share all of them as a talking point, because I really want to. When I read I know it's terrible, Joe. I do what I can, but it's kind of awful how little reading I've been able to do in the last 2 years. But I actually wanted to read this. If you're okay with if you're comfortable with me doing this, we have to do some text. I have to read some text as part of the story time. And this is actually from the acknowledgments of Jay's book for this book. And the reason I wanted to read it is it names a few things about why and what Jay is up to. Why Jay is up to these things and what it is. And so I found it helpful. And it's also, there are pieces of this I think others will resonate with. So this is the final paragraph, actually. It says, my work as a teacher and a scholar has in turn been shaped by so many students, colleagues, friends, and companions, particularly those who have shared how their own gender, sexuality, and embodiment have been figured as appalling, often, but not always, in relation to biblical texts and traditions. I would not be so foolish to claim that this book, Appalling Bodies, does or even could represent the response of all who have been touched across time by such texts and traditions. So I hesitate to say that this book is for them. Yet, this project is motivated by their, and sometimes our, disclosures and resistances. This is where I'm thinking of people who watch this. Wounds and outrages, debilities and desires, troubles and tricks, particularly when we have been targeted with or simply as figures of vilification or stigmatization. I try to find alternative angles on these figures as one kind of intervention or one set of provocations to these scenes that shape so many of our lives. This book, then, is dedicated to who and what haunts it, what has already happened, what has been done, those who have and have not survived, I almost get teary reading this, echoed in my not-so-elastic heart, you undersell yourself, in my ears when I'm overcome by the wails of Sleater-Kinney or the gossip, in my mind's eye when I remember, I'm assuming Carol is a former student or not, someone you don't clarify in the acknowledgement. So, and too many to name and adequately honor, but who still touch me. This may not be worth the trouble, but it is well past time I tried. Why you're doing what you're doing, and then, so that's a little bit of it that I wanted to interject for you or whatever. Talk to us. So what is this Appalling Bodies? What are you doing here? And how can it be, I'm thinking there's something liberating for people, liberating for you perhaps, liberating for others to have someone put to words these things that needed to be said?
I mean, I'm
you don't like that
I want to be careful about moderating what the book can do.
Okay.
I think texts, we do things with texts.
We do. I just know that it's often really liberating to have someone say these things, right?
And so I think the intent, like I think those words are pretty good for the intent. And I don't want to add more of them. I think part of this is one of the first line. I think the first line of the introduction is Paul is the least interesting thing about Paul's letters, right? So one of the things I think one of the mistakes that we've made historically, biblical scholars, biblical readers, biblical receivers, Christians of various stripes, is we think that if we could just figure out what the texts mean, that will tell us what to do or how we're supposed to feel or how we're supposed to believe.
Right.
And so we put Paul on top of us, right? In like a non-consensual way, honestly. And so a lot of work, especially for LGBTIQ plus folks, is trying to figure out like two of the bashing passages, the classic bashing passages, come from Paul's letters. And so we're like, okay, what does Romans 1 or 1 Corinthians 6, how does it or does it not apply to my life? Right? I think there's value I can perform and have been called to do, and I could do it for y'all, right? Like I could tell you why these are not the texts you think they are, right? These do not argue the way that people think that they do.
Right.
I could do a kind of very Halperinian kind of thing that like Paul's not thinking about sexual orientation the way that we do. I could do that, right? But I also think that continues to center Paul.
It does.
And one of the lessons that I'm stubborn. I'm a stubborn student of feminists and womanists, and folks who do anti-racist work as well as anti-colonial work.
Yes.
To kind of say like, no, like I'm not trying to make St. Paul love me, right? Or make these texts say that I'm okay.
Right.
Again, I could teach you how to do affirmative readings of these texts, and they are valuable.
They can.
But if we don't critically engage how they actually reinforce something really, really troubling.
Yes.
And we treat them like, oh, this is my salvation. This is my liberation. This tells me I'm okay.
Yes.
The conditions under which I've said I'm okay are actually the conditions that continue to do me harm.
Exactly.
Or if not me harm, do other people harm.
Absolutely.
Because Paul's letters are also xenophobic, right? That's one of the lessons that Randall Bailey teaches us. Like the two bashing passages have way more to do with people who are just different from Paul.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
They're far more clearly examples of what's called sexual exceptionalism than examples of sexual orientation. And it's because of their othering. They're engaging in ethno-racial othering, right? They are xenophobic texts. So rather than try to figure out, the stopping point cannot just be, here's what Paul's rhetorics were doing and how to understand them.
Right.
I think we should care about the people on the other side of these letters, the people who sparked the letters, the people who are being targeted by the letters, whether or not they matched up with the rhetorical targeting or not.
Right.
And
representation?
Their effects or not. And so one of the things that the book does is it follows around stigmatized figures of gender and sexual variation that Paul's letters call up, right? In order to get us to think differently about the audiences and those people who received or who sparked, in some instances also, frankly, co-created these letters.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of really important work that's growing now, too, about like just decentering Paul more and more and more. And these are lessons that we learned from Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza and Antoinette Clark-Wire, Elizabeth Castelli, again, like really important feminist biblical scholars who've worked on the letters that we've now called Paul's. So, for example, Paul seems to be referencing androgynous females in 1 Corinthians. He seems to be referencing castrated people, eunuchs, for lack of a better word, in Galatians. He's referencing enslaved people who are vulnerable to sexual use. And again and again and again, he's talking about Gentiles, what we call Gentiles, the ta ethne, the other people, and he thinks of them like they're barbarians. And he uses, that's the thing, the two texts that we cite, Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6, we're the ones who put those two together.
Exactly.
And said, this gives us the biblical or the New Testament or the Pauline view of homosexuality. I don't think they do, but that's the work that we've done with it. It's far more clear, both these texts are far more clearly arguing about barbarians than they are about hot gay stuff. If you're looking for hot gay stuff, in general, the Bible's super disappointing. Especially female stuff, right? It's like half of one verse in Romans 1, and it may not even be female.
Exactly.
Bruton would say it is. Bruton would say definitely this is female homoeroticism that Paul is calling up. I've got like just enough of a wiggle, like we can't be sure because it's just so short. It's like a few Greek words.
Right.
And there's lots of ways in which a woman could behave not according to nature.
Correct. Right.
Right. There's lots of things that you could do sexually that are not according to nature.
Take a male role and stay male
from the ancient point of view, right?
Yeah.
So I follow these figures around, right? The letters. I follow them around beyond the letters and the different ways in which ancient people talked about these folks, right? Androgynous females, castrated males, enslaved people, and barbarians. And they're always, each of them are figured as versions of gendered and sexual variation. And on the one hand, they're very clearly vilified and stigmatized in the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, all of the sources indicate that there's clearly some attractiveness to these figures. That like some people are choosing to castrate themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would a woman like shave her head in the ancient world, right? So we trying to get us to think differently about these figures. I then juxtapose them with more recent figures of gender and sexual variation that are like but not like them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also and so that's where like thinking about female masculinity and thinking about butch women and trans guys and androgynous females in the ancient world, putting them side by side. Not to say that like the Corinthian women who may or may not have shaved their heads are like my butch friends, but to say putting them next to each other helps us to see how gender and sexual vilification works in the ancient world.
Right. Because we can see it here. It helps us to see it there.
Right. And thinking about how we have treated intersex people, people born with intersex conditions, helps us to see Paul's hyperphallic fixation on penises in Galatians. And it's Paul's fixation. It's nobody else's. I don't care the Protestants who told you it's the Jews' fault or the Catholics' fault.
It's Paul.
No one else talks this way in the ancient world that we know of. Maybe maybe all these people did and they're all gone. We don't know.
Well, there is that pretty intense, like, if you don't do this, you'll be cut off from your people.
Right.
Pun intended.
He's making a really crude, awful joke. He's like, I hope you accidentally castrate yourselves. Right. And he makes a horrible joke at the expense of Onesimus and Philemon, like you're a useful, penetrable slave. Ha ha ha. And so there are moments in all these texts that are horrifying.
Right.
So rather than stopping at that horror and saying the horrifying point of view, so Paul is perpetuating a kyriarchal point of view. Paul's not the Roman emperor, right? But he wants to have his own little pyramid.
He has his own little pyramid.
He's convinced, right? So how do we keep from replicating that ish and saying that this picture of the ancient past, from the perspective of this person who is, I think, probably a colonized consciousness person, right? How do we look at these people differently and see them differently and see the potential resonances between people in our present and the past? And that's where this image of touch across time comes from. So you alluded to that. I think it's maybe in the acknowledgement. So Carolyn Dinshaw wrote a really amazing book. Not a biblical scholar.
I just ordered it because of this.
It's called Getting Medieval. And she uses this image of touch across time to get around these fights that we've had about histories of sexuality. So we have these folks like Halpern who say, no, the past is so different. We shouldn't even use the word homosexual. Maybe we shouldn't even use the word sexuality when talking about the past. Because when I say sexuality, he has an edited volume called Before Sexuality, right? Because the main way we think about sexuality is so governed by 19th and 20th century ideas of sexual orientation. And ancient people just didn't sort things that way, right? So the past has nothing to do with us. Like harsh break. They're like the past is a foreign country. They're not like us at all.
That's his choice.
And then we also have folks who are like, oh, like David and Jonathan's like me and my boyfriend, right? Or I'm going to read Ruth and Naomi at like my wedding to my girlfriend. It's like, and I've officiated some of those weddings. But when asked, like, I'm a bit of a killjoy. Like these are not super awesome texts. So one approach says, again, sharp break, or what scholars call altericism, right? That the past is other and we're nothing like it.
Right.
And then there's the approach that's more affirmative, that like we're cruising the scriptures, looking for people who are like us, looking for trans folks of the past, right? Looking for transcestors, looking for the centurion's boyfriend, like Ugh, right? No, it's the centurion's enslaved guy. Like, whether or not they had a sexualized relationship, that's not like a model. That's not a model for us. So what do we...
Let's name that, please, and then we'll be clear about why it's not a model for us. Right,
Yeah. So what do we do, right, with this? So they're not exactly like us, right? And they're also not completely different from us. So one of the things that Bruton's work kind of highlights for us is that, like, no, we got to actually pay attention to the terms on which these folks were negotiating, right? And so Dinshaw comes up with this image of, what are we doing when we're doing queer history? And what we're looking for is a touch across time, right? That is, that there might be ways in which people fall out of categories in the past that resonates with how people in the present fall out of categories. Now, the category work might be rather different, right? Ancient people sort the thing that we call gender differently, right? So someone who we might call stud now might look really feminine to Roman elite sources, because it just looks like a person who's sexually out of control, right? Like a guy who brags about having lots of sex, right? Which often, like, my neighbors are like, why are you telling me this? Like, I just met you, right? Or even someone who says, like, oh yeah, I can eat like 20 hot wings, right? I can take down 3 pizzas. Right. Like, you're allowed to do that as an elite ancient guy, but it kind of looks like you're letting your bodily appetites control you. You're kind of feminine. Right? Whereas they're like, wow, look at that guy. He's hyper masculine. Our codes of masculinity, like, might resonate across time, but they change. Right? So there are ways in which that maybe there's a shared queer positionality. There's a shared marginality, right? That there are ancient folks who did not fit the kyriarchal scripts that the Roman Empire tried to maintain to justify their forms of rule and to justify overthrowing people because you want to be emperor, right? Or you want your son to be emperor or something like that. Right? Those aren't exactly our codes of gender and status and economy and kyriarchy now, but they kind of sort of rhyme, right? And so it just lightly touches. She also uses this word contingent, right? To tinkere, to touch, like it's just like it's asymptotal, right? Like our lines are approaching each other, right? But we're like, and that's not to say that then, right, the people that Paul's letters targeted are exactly like me and the people that I know and love. Right. But there may be some. But they rhyme. Right? And if we learn to look for them differently and without assuming that a text gives us the whole picture of the past, if we realize it's rhetorics and we learn to read against the grain of it, like again, our feminist teachers have taught us that, right? We can see more, right? We see more about the past, and we actually learn, I think we also, in that traffic, we learn about ourselves too. And we see that better when we know people who are vilified and stigmatized now. When we experience stigmatization and vilification, the goal isn't to try to just get out from under that so other people get to be stigmatized. Right? Which is kind of like this purification, whitewashing thing that we do oftentimes with the bashing passages. And they say, well, Paul wasn't talking about me. He was talking about sluts, right? He was talking about people who were sexually inappropriate. They were talking about sexually out of control people. Like, I'm a good gay. I have one boyfriend. Like, we're going to get married. We are married. We own property. I vote, right? Et cetera, et cetera. There's that temptation of respectability. Right? And I think learn to do counter-kyriarchal analysis. Learning to not do single axis modes of analysis. Learning that forms of power intersect and force multiply. Right. And I would argue even the folks who say, like, I'm the good one, I'm a good lesbian, or I am like the trans that you can invite home and you can invite to preach a person, right? Like, we got to survive. So do what you like, do what you have to. There's lots of different ways of interpreting texts and engaging religious communities. And by me saying that, like, the historical break, like that's helpful. Like Paul uses horrifying terms, and the main Greek word for sex is use.
Right.
They can't. Our ancient sources literally can't imagine mutual sexuality.
Not that we
right?
can see. Yep.
Like
Exactly.
sex to them was fundamentally asymmetrical.
Yes.
Halperin's right. Bruton's right about that too. And we could do this work and say, oh, we are so not like them. Isn't that great? There's no asymmetries anymore. We have no problems with coercion and consent in our present. It's
Except for that we
true.
do.
It's true that we don't, like, on the face of it, we don't valorize
Right.
use. It's not like, it's not what we want.
Right.
When I imagine happy sexual futures for my friends, for my siblings, like I imagine, like, oh, I hope that, like, they may not be getting the same thing out of the sexual experience as their partner, but they're both getting things that they want out of it. Right? Like, I hope it's mutual and non-coercive.
Right.
So, like, it's relatively clear that a variety of ancient sources cannot compute that.
Right.
And Paul's letters repeat that point of view, right? Because the word he uses in Romans 1 is krasis, is use. Natural use is you make use of a subordinate.
Right.
And that could be, if you're a male, that could be a female.
That's right.
But that could be an enslaved person. That could be a conquered person.
Right.
That could be a person who's a different ethno-racial group. Yeah. Like, oh, I don't know, the Gentiles. Right? Anyone who's been conquered by the Romans. The barbarians, the barbaroi, right? But I would, so do what you have to do to survive. And sometimes, playing the respectability game and playing the, like, Paul's not really targeting me. Like, that's an important strategy to have, right? Or to say, oh, look, there are eunuchs in the ancient world and they fell out of sexual categories in ways that, like, resonate with me. And there's been a lot of folks who say, like, eunuchs are the ancient version of gay people, or the ancient version of intersex people, or the ancient version of trans people. And I think that does both really valuable work. And on the other hand, if we stay there, I think it reinstalls really problematic dynamics.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right. So if we're not smart and reflexive about where these ways of talking about human bodies in the past fit into kyriarchal systems, we're just going to reinforce kyriarchal systems in our present.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So cool. Try the affirmative. They're just like me. Or try the negative cutting, like they're nothing like us. Make those moves when you need to make those moves in your communities of accountability, or worse, the communities of people who are attacking you, silencing you, marginalizing you. Do that kind of work. But the kind of work that I've been trying to do in the Pauline bodies is, like, let's look at other ways of thinking about ancient bodies and our bodies, right? And get beyond the perspective of Paul, but while not, like, valorizing or recuperating these people of the past in these kind of clean, seamless ways, because it's not clean. It's really messy, and most of our lives, like, we're not going to get there. You're not going to be pure, right? It's gonna be difficult. It's gonna be messy and ugly and hard, and that's kind of what life is like. And so we could try to be better, right? But yeah. So that's so each of the chapters is kind of thinking about these kinds of juxtapositions. So, like, trans and butch ways of thinking about masculinity up against kind of what ancient people called androgyny. Intersex alongside kind of how people talked about castrated people, thinking about BDSM as a different way of kind of thinking about coercion and scripts of that when thinking about enslavement, and then thinking about how we still use sexual exceptionalism in our present, right? As another way of approaching the bashing passages.
Sexual exceptionalism.
Sure.
Can you clarify that? Just tease that out a little bit for folks.
So sexual exceptionalism is the idea. So Jasbir Puar wrote a book, and she kind of talked about homo nationalism, So there's ways in which you could use sexual alibis to justify imperial, colonial, racial, and gendered and sexual superiority. So in the ancient world, for example, the Romans were hyper focused on penetration and receptivity, and they claimed, right, that elite, free Roman enslaver males at the top of the kyriarchy, that they were the only ones who could penetrate. They were the impenetrable penetrators, right? And that everyone else, therefore, are not only subordinate, but also in some ways sexual weirdos. Right?
Okay.
Everyone they conquered had something wrong with them in terms of gender and sexuality. Empires have basically done that over and over and over again for centuries, right? So that Paul's letters repeat this way of like, because his examples of people who are doing sex wrong, if that's what he's even doing in Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6, are Gentiles, right? That the other ethno-racial people do sex wrong. And that shows that I am the superior. That shows that and we always only do it properly, right? And so sexual exceptionalism is a way of talking about and diagnosing and following how we talk about sex, that it reinforces these other dynamics. And so it's possible that you could be folded in and be included and like get some pips and get higher up in systems if you are willing to kind of say, well, those people have a barbarian sexuality. Those people have, kind of weird gender comportment. Kuhar is talking about it in terms of what she calls the monster terrorist fag. That one of the main ways that we still talk about racial and religious difference is to talk about in terms of gender and sexual difference. And that the us who's against them, we're the enlightened ones and we're very accepting. And this is a kind of a call to respectability. So Paul's letters are engaging in sexual exceptionalism, right? They're not talking about sexual orientation, right? But to use a different anachronism, to use a different 21st century set of terms, they are engaging in sexual exceptionalism.
Right.
Don't be like these other icky folks, right? And he's doing it as a colonized Jewish person. Right. And it doesn't come from Judaism. Like you can't blame Judaism for this. You can't blame Paul even for this. Paul has imbibed it from the ambient kyriarchal system. And this is how kyriarchies work. You get people to buy into it, right? Because you're like, well, at least I'm not them.
Yeah. Right.
And so Paul's examples of like how not to be are often, but not exclusively sexualized. And when they are sexualized, they're also gendered and ethno-racialized figures, right? So they're examples of sexual exceptionalism. Paul, of course, constructs himself as doing gender and sexuality, and also then implicitly race and ethnicity and empire properly, right? And there's all these other folks who are the ancient, like scholars call these folks unmen, right? So there are I do understand that grammatically we might say that a masculine person who reaches adulthood, we call them men. We say they're all men. But in the ancient world, that just was not the case. The word for man is reserved only for free, enslaving, powerful men. And there's all these other folks that if you met them now, maybe you'd say, oh, this is an adult male, this is a man. No, like a conquered person, an enslaved person, a lower status person. All of these are unmen. All of them are subordinate to the real men, the viri from the Latin point of view, right? They're at the tippity top, right? And the people at the tippity top are allowed to penetrate everybody lower than them, right?
Yes.
And that's good. That's what's called good sex in the ancient world, right? If someone higher in the kyriarchy is penetrating somebody lower, making use of somebody lower, that's what they call natural. That's what they call normal, right? It's not about like body fit and complementarity and all this other ish that like Europeans come up with later and that Americans have been bathing in, right? not that kind of stuff, right? And so all these other figures that Paul is calling up, they're all these unmen, right? They're androgynous folks, they're castrated folks, they're enslaved folks, and they're folks that would have been called barbaroi. They would have been called barbarians. And I just think they're far more interesting than Paul.
Well, I mean, it's almost, yes, they're definitely far more interesting, right?
There's lots of great books on Paul. You can read about them. You can get them. I can recommend, like, Bruton's book is in part about Paul. You should read Bruton's book.
Yes. I was going to say,
but I think
great books on Paul. There are some good books on Paul.
There are lots. I didn't say the majority of books on Paul are good.
It's true.
There are metric butt tons of books on Paul.
Books on Paul.
Right? I do not recommend reading the vast majority of them because, again, they're mostly focused on, I already accept Paul as an authority in my life. I want you to accept Paul as an authority in your life, or I assume it does. Right. Here, let me tell you what Paul meant. Right, so that you will do this.
Be okay with it and comfortable with it.
Right? It is mostly crusty, white, conservative, mostly Protestant or Protestant adjacent men.
Right.
Who are doing that work. And because kyriarchy works this way, occasionally a woman or occasionally a person of color could also argue this way.
Right.
Like, that's the lesson of Margaret Thatcher. Right. That's the lesson of, if Hillary Clinton was pretty close, right? Secretary of State, that's pretty good. Right.
Yeah.
That's the lesson of being, the queen mum. Right. That's the lesson of being the mother of the Roman emperor. Right.
Indeed.
She is not oppressed in the same way that a Galilean peasant woman would have been.
Indeed.
Right. So,
Indeed.
Yes. And there are people in the chat mentioning some folks. Yes.
Yes. I wasn't sure how that happened. Yeah. No. April is tracking. April is tracking. I'm just wondering if anyone here who's able to be here live has any questions for Jay before we head out. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and the kind of you sharing a little bit with us the work you're up to, what you're trying to do, what you're in a sense decentering Paul to look at, to have a richer understanding or a more complex look at, I guess. I don't know if we ever fully understand, do we? But we can look at differently and more complexly some of these texts and how that helps us to see things about the first century differently. I tend, just so you know, Jay, people tend not to ask a whole lot of questions. When I have scholars on, they're doing a lot of just chit chat amongst themselves. So don't take it any kind of way that if there aren't any questions for you specifically. I think a lot of what happens here is we have fun exchanges and people enjoy it. And that's just, we're giving them things to think about. So I am going to put this one up. Thank you, Sharonda. I just wanted to say how super interesting today's story time is or was. I could listen to the two of you talk for hours. Thank you for.
That's super kind. I could talk to Dr. Bird for hours. Maybe not today, but I could.
We could, yeah. We could keep going. Okay, this is interesting. We will have more questions next time you come on. That's nice. Thank you, Super Saiyan Slan. Sometimes that's what it is, right? We have we engage or listen, and then we have questions that percolate, right?
Well, maybe sometime, we could do a sequel to talk about QTR or other things.
We could do that. I would love to do that. Actually, I meant it when I said I'm just thrilled about QTR and April Van Ryn. I need to double check I'm pronouncing that correctly. I just want to comment that I've never heard the idea of using sexual proclivity as a means of justifying conquering, but it totally tracks. Oh, hey there, considering anew. I didn't know that you were here with us today, so it's nice to hear from you. Question: if Paul was indeed unmarried, what was the status of unmarried men? Right. Were they men in those days? Great question. Thank you.
Short answer, not really. And again, so for folks who are interested in Paul, there's definitely queer ways of reading Paul, right? Paul is a massive gender failure in many terms.
I know. Right? I was like, wait, he announces that he's not paired up, right?
But the fascinating thing is, again, I think because he's so, from what I can tell from the artifacts that we have, from these letters, from the residues of these exchanges, because that's what they are. They're not theological tracts.
And they're not both sided. We only get
right. They're these leftovers of their ephemera, right? And we're lucky that we have them because I think they help us to learn a little bit more about the people on the other side. And that's why I keep getting sucked back into Paul's letters. I try to work some on the Gospels, but I get sucked back in over and over again. It's like The Godfather. But I think the ways in which Paul's letters operate, how about that? Rather than talk about Paul as a figure, right? It seems like they're so steeped in the ambient ways of thinking kyriarchically that even when they're doing something counter-kyriarchal, basically saying like weaklings have sex. Like, you could go ahead and have sex if you can't hack it, which by the way is a very like if you want to trouble your heterosexual friends, right? Like I haven't heard that as a wedding toast just yet, but like I'm so glad you're married because you freaks can't control yourselves, right? I've heard a lot of bad wedding toasts, but I've never heard anyone quite say that. Paul comes pretty close to arguing that way at times, including in those middle chapters of 1 Corinthians. So like, while on the one hand, there's something kind of weird and weird is not quite right, but counterculture about saying the best way to be a follower of God as revealed to us through my being Paul, my experience of Christ, is to withdraw from sexual relations and to be focused. Right. That's antisocial. That's antisocial behavior. But also, Paul thinks the apocalypse is already happening. It thinks we're in the midst of a giant transformation. Time is hella short, right, for Paul. Right. Any day now, it's all going to be done. The transformation is going to be done. So it kind of makes sense. Like, if you're short on time, maybe you got to prioritize. So that itself would not align nicely with Roman imperial points of view. And yet, like he's still like, the people at the tippity top are the ones who are like me, who can control themselves. And bodily control as a way of talking is a hyper masculine, hyper racialized, hyper propertied, hyper enslaving way of talking in the ancient world, right? That like the way you show you are a masculine man is the first layer is controlling your own body. And if you can control your own body, then that means I could probably put you in charge of other things. Right? I can put you in charge of women, children, enslaved people, other animals, property. You control that household well. I could put you in charge of this part of the city. I could put you in charge of this whole city. I could put you in charge of this whole region. I might be a little bit careful because now you're getting really powerful and like you might want to overthrow me as the emperor. But like it's that concentric circles of control. And so while absolutely in the Roman Empire, Augustine actually goes about trying to convince elite men to have sex with their elite wives so they can have more elite sons because they were kind of running short, he kind of felt like, on elite men. And so there is this marriage legislation that's happening and encouraging of sexual penetration of your wives. And so Paul is kind of counter, but on the other hand, he's reinforcing this dynamic of control. He's just slightly changing the coordinates. So first layer you could say is like, look, even Paul was anti-marriage. That's really a stretch to say that either the Jesus of the Gospels or Paul of the canonical letters, of the undisputed letters, are pro-marriage. They are not pro-marriage.
They are not at all.
Not even close.
Thank you.
So you should bring that up
Yes.
when people focus on that, whether it's straight marriage or just also like marriage is the end-all be-all for all of us. It's just not. Also, like housing and healthcare should be dependent upon who you should up and who you agree to live with. Right? Like it's just these are like we should be sorting these things differently. So that's a helpful tip to start. Yeah. But if you rely on it too much, what you've just done is you've re-imported a kyriarchal argument that has prioritized a slightly different thing. So
we're finding a way to have authority all over again.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Joe. This is I'm wondering if there are any other comments or questions, but there are. Yes, I'm thank you. Yeah, should I throw this one up there? Noodles, you are new to me. Welcome. I'm happy to have you here. Or yes, you may have been here, but I've not seen your name. I'm an Episcopal trans woman, and it's my goal to evangelize to my trans siblings. Being a queer Christian is often being treated poorly from both sides. Sometimes I believe that.
Yes.
Or seen as part of the problem. Oh, it just breaks my heart. Thank you for speaking up.
Can I just say that there's a lot more of you than you know?
That's
right? That there's a long and distinguished history in the global north of assuming that religion and sexuality or religion gendered sexuality like that they're but what we've done culturally is we've seeded the ground to regressive reactionary negative forces. And actually there's a long and distinguished history of gender, sexual, and embodied variability inside of Christianity and inside of Judaism's I should say Christianities, plural too. I
Mm-hmm.
think this is also the case for other religions, but I am not as much an expert in those religions, so I want to be cautious about that. So unfortunately, this is not a new way of arguing and the new way of us treating each other. That there's this idea that somehow to be gay or trans or bi or multi or non-binary or ace is to somehow be outside of normative Christianity. I would encourage you to not cede that ground. Insofar as it's healthy and good for you too, by the way. Like do what you need to do to manage your own lives, but to also know there's a long and distinguished history of people who are trying really, really hard to say that Christianity is hella straight. And it's just not, or at least it's just not only.
Right, exactly. And the fact that the more that you have to yell it is a nod to the fact that it's not it's not working.
And this is how you got to learn to read against the grain, right? This is why you got to read Ann Wyer's book, Corinthian Women Prophets. Paul is working so hard to convince the women to behave a certain way. That's not a sign that they agreed with Paul. That's a sign that they were not behaving the way he thought.
From him,
right? If you hear someone yelling to someone in the other room, Cletus, get your hands off that turkey. You think Cletus is at the very least near the turkey.
Exactly.
Right?
Not just trying to shove it
when
all
you say don't. When you say don't not, like you got to be careful. You can't like overread this, what some people call mirror reading. Right? And so like there like and the happy news is there's a lot of really great work happening in trans-biblical interpretation. Noodles. And trans work in religiosity in general. And there's a lot of resources now for dealing with this. I'm very, very lucky to be co-editing with a couple folks a volume on trans-biblical interpretation. And the histories are much longer than you think. And if anyone else tells you that like this trans stuff is new and I'm so confused by this,
it's not.
No. Again, gender and embodied and sexual variation has been a feature of humanity for as long as humans have been narrating ourselves.
Right. I mean, why would that have changed in any way? Right. That's just a part of our realities. I also am just thinking of various very openly or open about their bodily experiences in being trans, people who are ordained in various traditions currently, that there are communities like that. And I'm thinking the Presbyterian Church actually has an openly trans male who's ordained pastor and it's kind of a big deal within the Presbyterian Church.
There's some great trans seminarian resources in general. You should check out CLGS at PSR. It's a lot of letters. I'm sorry. Pacific School of Religion. But there are some wonderful resources for trans religious folks, especially if you are fortunate enough to be located in North America and have some economic privilege. Easier to say than done. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Noodles, for speaking up. I appreciate that and appreciate your responses to Noodles with your comments, Joe. Jay, it's very nice. I know. You said it. I need to wrap this up.
We've been at it for an hour and a half.
We have, and I appreciate.
Thank you, folks, for tuning in and listening.
Yeah, thanks for your generosity here, Joe. I appreciate it. I'm gonna boot you out here for a second. Thank you so much for those of you who wanted to be here and were able to be here live. I very much appreciate it. Love having people chat with each other and with us at times. I appreciate all the ways that you all support me. It warms my heart when I see new people subscribing to my channel. I think that you all are sharing things or people are hearing about it, maybe from the algorithm, whatever the case. When you like a video or subscribe to my channel, that helps other people who are similarly minded to you to find my work. And that's a win-win-win, right? So thank you for supporting me in all the various ways. And next week is I'll be back talking on my own, but oh no, wait, I think I actually have another scholar on next week. I have to look ahead. But also next week is the live conversation for everyone who is supporting me through in any kind of way through Patreon. If you're interested in joining us, that would be lovely. So I will be back next week with a conversation with someone. I just can't remember who that is. So why do I have here we go. So I'll see you next week.